I sat down to write this episode this week, and I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say. I think I was questioning whether I wanted to say it at all. It's been a weird week. An autoimmune disease that's been relatively quiet for a while decided to remind me that it's still there. I've developed psoriasis, which I originally thought was basically just an annoying spot on my skin. Turns out it's potentially a much bigger issue than that. And now I'm facing the possibility of changing a medication, one that has worked incredibly well for me for 8 years. 8 years. That's not nothing. And listen, the irony is not lost on me that I literally just did an entire episode about my health journey and finally getting back to good, only for my body to apparently say, but wait, there's more. Apparently that episode needed a sequel. But when you've spent as many years as I have trying to figure out what is wrong with your body, finding something that actually works starts to feel almost sacred. You don't want to mess with it. So my attention shifted. Instead of writing, I was researching, asking questions, talking to doctors, trying to understand what this means and what happens next. And at the same time, I had something else I'd been counting on become uncertain. Nothing catastrophic happened. Actually, that's important. Nothing really happened at all. It was just another answer I was waiting for. And apparently, if you give my brain an unanswered question in enough time, it is perfectly capable of writing an entire Netflix original drama series to fill in the blanks. And somehow I'm always the problem in the plot. Multiple seasons, probably a shocking season finale. Maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe I'd done something wrong. Maybe I needed to change my plans. Maybe I'm just not good enough. And pretty soon, that one unanswered question had me looking at everything else I had planned and thinking, maybe I need to change things. Maybe this isn't what people want. Maybe this is a good place to take a break while I regroup and rearrange everything else and blow it all up. And then I realized something. I had taken something I didn't know and turned it into something I believed. And worse, I was about to start making decisions based on it. That's when I knew. This is exactly the episode I need to write right now. Welcome back to ICMM, Living Life Unpaused, the podcast version. I'm your host, Abby Ventrilo. And if you're just joining us, this is the podcast where we talk about what it actually looks like to create a life you want to live, not by blowing everything up overnight, not by waiting until you have the perfect plan, but by doing one intentional thing at a time to keep moving your life forward. And apparently, this week, my one intentional thing is going to be practicing what I preach. Because there was a time when a week like this would have stopped me. Actually, let's be honest. It wouldn't have just stopped me. I would have created an incredibly convincing argument for why stopping was the smart thing to do. I've got health stuff going on. I need to focus on myself. Something else I had planned suddenly felt uncertain. Maybe that's a sign. Maybe the podcast needs a break. Maybe this idea has run its course. Maybe people aren't interested. And all of those things sound completely reasonable. That's what makes quitting on yourself so sneaky sometimes. It doesn't always sound like I'm scared. Sometimes it sounds incredibly responsible. But I started asking myself a different question this week. Am I actually taking care of myself? Or am I looking for permission to stop? And that word permission kept sticking with me. Because if you listened to last week's episode with Dr. Michelle Retz, you probably know exactly why. We'll come back to that. Because today I want to talk about doing something for yourself. Not selfishly, not without caring about anyone else, and definitely not pretending you don't want success or encouragement or money or recognition. I want to talk about what happens when the reason you're doing something belongs to you. And I also want to talk about something I think gets in the way of that more than we realize: the stories we tell ourselves about what other people think. Because I think when you stop letting those stories make your decisions for you, everything changes. Here's what was different about this week: I still wanted to write. That's what caught my attention. Even with everything else going on, I kept thinking about this episode. I kept making notes. I kept thinking, oh, that's something I need to say, something I need to expand on. And when I actually sit down to write these episodes, I get lost in them. I lose track of time and forget to eat. When I record them, I feel like myself. I love interviewing people. I love hearing their stories. I love pulling out the moment in someone's life when something shifted and asking them questions about it. And I love these solo episodes because they force me to sit down and work through what I think. Sometimes I don't even know exactly what I think until I start writing it. That's why I started this. ICMM started because I realized I had been waiting for my own life to start again. I needed this. The fact that other people have connected to it has been this incredible surprise. And actually, before I go any further, I need to say something about that. You guys are starting to blow me away a little bit. The podcast is breaking records for me right now. More of you are listening, you're sharing episodes, you're sending them to friends, you're reaching out to me and telling me what you're doing differently because of something you heard here. And I cannot adequately explain how much that means to me, especially because I know a lot of you aren't people who normally comment on everything or send messages to podcast host. So when you take the time to tell me, I heard this and it made me think about, I pay attention. Thank you, truly. But here's the interesting thing. Those messages mean a lot to me. They're just not why I started. And I think there's a really important difference between appreciating validation and requiring validation, because it's incredibly easy to confuse the two. You start something because you love it, and then people respond. And suddenly, you start watching the responses. How many people listened? How many people liked it? How many people followed? How many commented? Did this episode do better than the last one? Why did that reel perform better? And suddenly something that started internally is being graded externally. I've caught myself doing this. When I first started posting about ICMM, I wasn't thinking much about followers. I had something I wanted to say. Then people started reaching out. People I hadn't talked to in years were telling me something I said made them think differently about their own life. So I kept talking. And trust me, I have plenty to talk about. But then I started looking at the numbers. And suddenly, I'm wondering how to get more followers, how to make better videos, what performs better. And yes, those things matter if I'm building a business, which I am. I'm not going to sit here and give you the fake inspirational version where I pretend numbers and money don't matter. They do. But I've had to separate two questions. Is this working? And is this worth doing? Those aren't the same question. Something can absolutely be worth doing before you have any evidence that it's working. And something can technically be working, getting views, making money, receiving attention, and still not be worth doing if you've had to edit yourself completely out of it. At some point, we become incredibly accustomed to having witnesses. We don't just go somewhere, we post that we went somewhere. We don't just accomplish something, we announce the accomplishment. We don't just start something, we launch it. And I'm not criticizing that. Obviously, I have an entire podcast and social media accounts devoted to sharing what I'm doing and thinking daily. But I do think it's worth asking, would I still want this if nobody knew I was doing it? Because that question can get uncomfortable really fast. Would you still run if you couldn't post your race time? Would you still want the job if nobody was impressed by the title? Would you still buy that thing if nobody else ever saw it? Would you still start the business if your friends didn't think it was cool? Would you still create the thing if only 12 people saw it? Would you still change your life if nobody applauded it? But I think there's something even more interesting happening underneath our need for other people's approval. Because a lot of the time, nobody has actually criticized us. Nobody has told us to stop. Nobody has said our idea is stupid. We just think they might. And then we respond to the imaginary criticism as though it actually happened. When I started posting videos, I thought about creating a new account that no one knew about in my current circle because I was afraid of what people might think that knew me. Turns out you've continued to be my biggest fans. But think about how often we do this. Someone doesn't respond to your text. And instead of thinking they haven't responded to my text, you think, are they mad at me? Have I done something? Your boss puts 15 minutes on your calendar with no explanation, and suddenly you're replaying everything you've done for the last 3 months. A friend seems a little quiet at dinner. Did I say something? You share something that you're extremely proud of, and it doesn't get the response you expected. Maybe people think this is stupid. There's the fact, and then there's the story. And we are really good storytellers, especially when we're telling stories about ourselves. That's what I caught myself doing this week. There was something I didn't have an answer to. That's it. That was the fact. I didn't have an answer. But that wasn't satisfying enough for my brain. So my brain started supplying one. I misread the situation. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe circumstances had changed. Maybe this was saying something about what I'm building. Maybe I needed to rethink my plans. Notice how quickly we went from, I don't have an answer, to, maybe I need to rethink what I'm doing with my entire life. That's quite a leap. And then something happened. I eventually got more information. And guess what? The story I'd been telling myself wasn't the story at all. Things had changed. Timing had changed. Life had happened. That's it. It had nothing to do with me. And I almost laughed when I realized it. Because how much energy had I spent responding to something that existed almost entirely in my own head? I think we do this because uncertainty is uncomfortable. We'd almost rather have a bad answer than no answer at all. So when we don't know why someone did something, we fill in the blank. And because we're human, we have this irritating tendency to put ourselves right in the middle of the story. They didn't respond because of me. They didn't invite me because of me. They didn't hire me because I'm not good enough. They didn't like it because I'm embarrassing myself. Maybe. Sometimes people absolutely do reject us. But sometimes they're busy. Sometimes they're dealing with something you know nothing about. Sometimes the budget disappeared. Sometimes they forgot. Sometimes their priorities changed. And sometimes the algorithm just didn't show anybody your video. Sometimes a person can genuinely like you and still not have capacity for you. And sometimes you will never know. That's the part I think we have to get better at. Because if you're going to do something for yourself, you have to become comfortable with not always knowing what everybody else thinks about it. Otherwise, you'll spend your entire life adjusting yourself in response to stories you've written on other people's behalf. And think about how absurd that is. You're shrinking yourself to accommodate an opinion nobody actually expressed. You're quitting before somebody can reject you. You're staying quiet before somebody can criticize you. You're making the dream smaller before anybody can tell you it's too big. We talk a lot about not letting other people's opinions control our lives. Maybe we should also talk about not letting our imaginary versions of other people's opinions control our lives. Because those things might actually be controlling us more. And yes, if you put yourself out there enough, there will be times when you are criticized or people don't agree with you publicly. I watched an interview Taylor Swift did for the New York Times Magazine recently that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She was talking about writing songs for herself first. What struck me wasn't just the creative advice, it was the freedom in it. At some point, you make the thing and you release it. She said something like, you have to go, here it is. I hope you like it. But even if you don't, if you never do, it's okay because I did it for me. I liked it before you even got here. Think about the amount of freedom in that. Because this is Taylor Swift, one of the most successful artists on the planet. And there are still people who don't like her. People criticize her music, her relationships, her clothes, her business decisions, the way she dances, probably the way she holds a fork. It's the internet. I'm sure somebody has thoughts. There is apparently no amount of success you can achieve where everybody finally agrees that you're good enough. So if Taylor Swift can't achieve universal approval, what exactly are the rest of us waiting for? Maybe universal approval was never available. Maybe that's the trick. We're trying to earn something that doesn't exist. And I think this matters for another reason. When you're doing something because you genuinely love it, I think you're usually better at it. We see people succeed all the time and think, I should do that. She made 6 figures selling that. He built a huge following talking about this. That podcast blew up because they did this. That business model works. I'll do that. And there's nothing wrong with inspiration. Seeing someone else do something can be exactly the permission you need to realize something is possible. But there's a huge difference between being inspired by someone's success and trying to recreate their result. Because you can copy what someone does, you can't copy why they do it. And people can feel the difference. When you genuinely love something, you're curious about it. You think about it when you're driving. You write something down at 11:30 at night because you don't want to forget it and you can't stop thinking about it. You want to get better. You keep tweaking it. You keep learning. You keep showing up when the numbers aren't particularly exciting because the actual work still interests you. That's very different from doing something because somebody on Instagram told you this is how they made $300,000 last year. Because what happens when you follow their exact formula and you don't make $300,000? What happens when their video gets 1 million views and yours gets 312? What happens when their podcast has 50,000 downloads and yours has 50? If the outcome was the only thing you actually wanted, you're going to get bored really quickly because you didn't want the work. You wanted their results. And those are not the same thing. This is something I've been thinking about a lot as I build ICMM. There are plenty of people I could copy. There are podcasts I could make mine sound more like. There are social media formulas I could follow. There are AI programs who will tell you exactly how many seconds your hook should be, and exactly how you're supposed to phrase something, and exactly what you're supposed to post. Some of that advice is incredibly useful, But at some point, I have to ask, does this still sound like me? Because if I optimize myself completely out of this thing, what exactly am I building? Inspiration can get you started, but authenticity is what keeps you going. And ironically, authenticity may also be the thing that makes people care about what you are doing. Because you can't manufacture genuine interest indefinitely. Eventually, people can tell. And more importantly, you can tell. There's another way external validation shows up that I think is even more dangerous. Sometimes we don't wait for someone to reject our idea. We do it for them. This is probably stupid, but I know this will never happen, but okay, don't laugh. I know this sounds crazy. Or worse, we just go quiet. I used to do this all the time, partly because I wasn't sure where I was headed, but also because I was afraid of the rejection. How often do we apologize for our dreams before we've even said what they are? We're trying to soften the rejection before it happens. Except sometimes nobody was going to reject it. We rejected it ourselves. And I think we do this constantly. You don't apply because people might think you're reaching. You don't post because someone you know might roll their eyes. You don't start the business because somebody might ask whether you're actually making money. You don't admit you want to write a book because what if somebody thinks, I seriously doubt she's going to make that happen. You don't tell people your biggest version of the dream. You give them the socially acceptable version, the smaller version, the one that's easier to explain. And the dream gets smaller before anyone has even told you no. Here's where I think we need some nuance. I'm not telling you to shut everyone out and not listen to anyone. That's terrible advice. And I'm not telling you to listen only to those who agree with you and build you up. There are people in my life whose opinions matter enormously to me. There are people who know things I don't know. People who will tell me when something isn't working. People who will challenge me in my perspective. People whose judgment I trust. Figure out who those people are and listen to those people. But everybody doesn't get a vote. One of the best filters I've found is this. Do I want the life of the person giving me this advice? Not literally every part of their life, but in this area, have they built something I respect? Are they living in a way I admire? Do they understand what I'm trying to do? Do they actually know me? If not, why am I giving their opinion the same weight as someone who does? You don't owe every opinion a seat at the table just because it showed up. Casey and I recently started watching old episodes of The Wonder Years, which is still just as good of a show as I remembered it being from when I was a kid. In this one episode, Kevin Arnold is agonizing about whether or not he should call his crush. And he joins his family in the living room to watch astronauts from Apollo 8 transmit live pictures of the Earth for the first time from lunar orbit. Something that, for basically all of human history, was impossible until then. And suddenly, this thing he's been agonizing over, calling a girl, gets put into perspective. What's the worst that happens? She doesn't answer. Or she answers and says she's not interested. Okay, life continues. In the grand scheme of things, this is incredibly small. And I love that because I think sometimes we need perspective more than we need courage. What is actually the worst thing that happens? You apply and don't get the job. You ask and they say no. You invite someone onto your podcast and they never respond. But I think it goes further than that. What exactly happened here? I didn't lose anything I had. My podcast still exists. The listeners didn't disappear. I still have things to say. And maybe, instead of interpreting that silence as rejection, I use it as evidence that rejection isn't actually that scary. Maybe I reach higher. Maybe I email someone I previously thought was too big for this podcast. What's the worst that happens? They don't respond? I've already done that. So maybe the question isn't, what if they say no? Maybe the question is, what am I missing because I'm so busy trying to avoid hearing no? And this brings me back to Dr. Retz. Last week, we were talking about boundaries. And at one point, she essentially said, sometimes people just need permission. So she gave it permission to say no, permission to say not right now, permission to take care of yourself. And I love that. But I've been thinking about it differently this week. Because how much of our lives do we spend waiting for someone else to give us permission? Permission to start, permission to stop, permission to change our minds, permission to want something bigger, permission to rest, permission to leave, permission to say, I want this. And maybe sometimes we do need someone else to hand us that permission slip. I think that's part of what Dr. Retz was doing. Sometimes hearing another person say, you're allowed, cracks something wide open. But eventually, you have to learn to sign your own permission slip because nobody is coming with a clipboard to do it for you. There isn't some official grown-up who's eventually going to arrive and say, Abby, we've reviewed your application and you're now officially permitted to try and build this into something huge. Congratulations, here's your badge. You can proceed. That's not happening. At some point, the permission has to come from me, and yours has to come from you. Maybe you need someone to tell you that today. Fine, I'll do it. You have permission. You have permission to want something nobody around you understands yet. You have permission to be new at something. You have permission to be bad at it before you get good at it. You have permission to change your mind. You have permission to stop pursuing a dream you don't even want anymore. You have permission to pursue one that makes absolutely no sense to anybody else. You have permission to make something because making it makes you happy. You have permission to try without knowing whether it's going to work. There's your permission slip. I keep coming back to something a longtime mentor said to me after the very first episode of this podcast. He called me and told me how much he liked it. And then he said something along the lines of, I don't know if you're ever going to make money doing this, but imagine the lives you've impacted by sharing your story. At the time, I thought, well, I'd like to make money too. Let's not rule that one out. I still would. I'm building something here. I have big plans for ICMM. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But that conversation gave me a definition of success before the numbers had a chance to give me one. Did it matter? Did it move somebody? Did it make me think? Did I enjoy making it? Did I become more myself while I was doing it? That's a pretty good starting scoreboard. The response isn't why I continue. The response is confirmation that something I already wanted to make mattered to someone else too. And that distinction matters. Because if I remove the audience completely, no likes, no downloads, no compliments, no criticism, no messages, no applause, what would I still choose? Because doing it makes my life feel more like mine. That's a question I think all of us should ask occasionally. Not because everything has to be a passion project. We all do things because they pay the bills. We do things because our families need us. We do things we don't particularly enjoy because that's part of being a functioning human. I'm not suggesting you quit doing laundry because it doesn't light your soul on fire. I'm talking about the things that are supposed to belong to you. Your goals, your dreams, the life you're trying to build. How much of that is actually yours? So here's your one thing this week. I want you to do something you enjoy and don't tell anyone about it. I know. This is coming from a woman who just spent an entire podcast talking to you about her life. But hear me out. Do something this week purely because you want to do it, and don't turn it into anything else. Don't post it. Don't photograph it for later. Don't track it. Don't make it part of a challenge. Don't use it to improve yourself. Don't figure out how to monetize it. Don't even make it particularly impressive. Just do something because you like doing it. And pay attention to how weird that might feel. Because I think we've gotten so accustomed to attaching an outcome to everything we do that sometimes we've forgotten what it's like to enjoy something without needing it to produce something in return. A walk has to count towards our steps. A hobby should become a side hustle. A vacation needs pictures. A workout needs results. A book needs to teach us something. Even rest has somehow become recovery so we can be more productive tomorrow. We're constantly turning our lives into evidence. Evidence that we're productive, interesting, successful, disciplined, happy, moving forward. But what if for once there was no evidence? What if you did something and the only person who ever knew how much you enjoyed it was you? That's your one thing this week. Do something that has absolutely nothing to prove, and then notice whether you can let that be enough. I started this week thinking disruption meant I needed to change the plan. And maybe that's the biggest thing I've learned from doing ICMM myself. Movement doesn't always mean charging forward. Sometimes movement is simply refusing to abandon yourself because the room got quiet. And I think that's what doing it for yourself really means. Not that you don't care what anyone thinks. Not that you don't want success. Not that you don't want people cheering for you. Let them cheer. Let it feel good. Celebrate the numbers when they grow. Celebrate the sale. Celebrate the promotion. Celebrate the person who tells you that something you did changed their day. Just don't hand any of those people the authority to decide whether you keep going, because that permission was never really theirs to give you. Before I go, I really do want to say thank you. This podcast is starting to reach more people than it has ever before, and I'm breaking my own records right now. Every listen, every share, every person who sends an episode to somebody and says, "You need to hear this. You're helping build this with me," and I don't take that lightly. If this is your first episode, welcome. There are 11 more waiting for you. I hope you'll go back to find the one that meets you where you are. And if you haven't listened to last week's conversation with Dr. Michelle Retz, I especially hope you'll go back to that one. We talked about stress, hormones, health, boundaries, and what it actually means to take care of your whole self. And apparently, we also talked about permission slips. I just didn't know yet how much I was going to need that part. If this episode made you think of somebody who's been waiting for permission, please send it to them. And remember, you don't have to change your whole life today. Just do one intentional thing that moves it forward. Until next week, be careful out there.